March 9th, 1945, Western Caroline Islands, Ulithi Atoll, Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, Nakajima, C-6N, Saiun Pilot Lieutenant Miki Takuma, Observer Warrant Officer Ito Kunio. The engine note is clean at altitude. The Nakajima noses along the pressure blue oxygen masks tight frost feathering the camera port. Takuma eases starboard, lets the horizon settle. Below a lagoon as wide as a city grid opens in turquoise sheets, and metal rectangles gleam like rooftops in noon sun. Flight decks, row after row. You feel the moment the breath catches, the shutter starts chattering, the practiced scan becomes a count. 1, 3, 8, 12, 15. Ulithi Atoll does not look like a base so much as a factory floor laid on water. Fleet oilers lie out by the reef passes, tenders bracket lines of destroyers, ammunition lighters scurry in wake-combed threads. The vertical camera snaps again and again as Takuma holds the run true. He and Ito have flown far to find this picture. The aircraft is fast-built precisely for this job, a carrier-borne reconnaissance machine the Allies call MERT, the Imperial Japanese Navy Saiun, able to outrun interception and bring home film instead of rumors. He banks shallow, careful to keep distance from the anchorage flak arcs, and resets the count with a navigator's suspicion. The carriers are moored in neat files on the windward side, Essex-class hulls, mostly with the flat slabs of flight decks, catching white light between blotches of parked aircraft. 15, by his tally more than a dozen at least, and the pattern says rotation and depth, not a single strike group pausing between raids. An earlier report already shocked staff. A Saiun on March 5th photographed 16 carriers here. The fact is not a rumor in a wardroom anymore. It is emulsion and geometry. Whatever Japan told itself about American tempo is out there on the lagoon, anchored and ready. Takuma rides the Saiun a little higher, lets the camera chew through another magazine. The atoll's sandy islets, Mogmog, Sorlin, Falalop, sit like buttons on a turquoise coat. Barges draw narrow, wakes tugs, pivot destroyers at buoys, and at the edges of the anchorage you can pick out workshop hulls and repair ships. Ulithi has become the hinge of the Fifth Fleet's war against Japan. The photograph shows what a hinge looks like when it is scaled to an ocean. The United States has concentrated carriers here in numbers that match the scale of the coming operation. Staff officers in Tokyo will trace these outlines with rulers and feel something cold. The enemy has 15 carriers in one anchorage and a logistics machine to feed them. Ito calls bearings, clicks off a new set of oblique frames, and passes up a pad with rough deck counts. Takuma does not answer. He flies the line, then eases away on a lazy arc that trades altitude for margin. The Saiun's best defense is speed and the emptiness of the sky. He will not linger where radar fingers might reach. The camera whirs down and the two men sit for a moment above a fact that no briefing can soften. You can rewrite doctrine, but you cannot argue with a contact sheet. Back in Japan, officers will pin these prints to boards and sketch arcs from Kyushu to the Marianas, from Ulithi to Okinawa. The Azusa Special Attack Unit will be tasked for a long strike, a night run at the anchorage on March 11th, because the photos prove the carriers sleep here. They will count the same squares Takuma counted and imagine a single blow shattering them. But the numbers on the lagoon are a different kind of truth depth of force, redundancy, repair. Even if a kamikaze punches into a hangar deck, there are 14 more flight decks to launch at dawn. That is what the picture says. 2 nights after these frames are shot, a Yokosuka P-1Y Jinga will come in low and smash into United States Ship Randolph's stern just below the flight deck, killing 26 and wounding 105 as sailors watch a movie, a violent, localized success against a system that keeps operating. Randolph will be alongside a repair ship at Ulithi within 48 hours, her wound visible and already being measured for the fix, and she will rejoin for Okinawa in April. The photograph and the repair log tell the same story in different languages' procedure scales. Shock does not. Takuma levels for home. The Saiun's nose is pointed into long miles of weather and darkness, but the mission is already complete. Film can be lost, the negatives can be burned in a hangar fire, men can be intercepted and killed. What endures is the realization forced by what they saw. The United States Navy is operating carriers in mass in rotation with an anchorage that functions like an assembly line afloat. 15 decks at rest mean hundreds of sorties ready to fly, and a fleet culture that treats a carrier not as a duel, but as a unit in a schedule. There is no duel here to win. There is only a system to outproduce, and Japan cannot. The shutter clacks its last frame. The lagoon recedes. The atoll's strings of sand fade to a pale stitch on the sea. You watch through the camera port until the decks become glints, then dust, then memory. The Saiun carries the proof home. The prints travel in a metal case that smells faintly of oil and salt. Couriers bring them through corridors where blackout curtains hang in tired folds. A door opens on a map room. Cigarette smoke hangs in a slow layer under the lights. Officers bend over a table. Wooden rulers, chinograph marks, silence. A staff commander lifts the first contact sheet with careful fingers. The lagoon fills the frame in pale blue and silver. Squares appear, decks and shadows. He moves the ruler in short strokes and counts in a whisper. Others count with him, each on a different starting line, as if a new count might give a kinder number. The figure holds. 15. The figure holds again. More than a dozen carriers at anchor. Not rumour, not an intercepted boast. Steel and geometry on film. He sets the ruler down and reaches for the next sheet. Oilers near the passes. Auxiliaries inboard. Lines of destroyers at buoys. Repair ships tucked along the edge. Someone traces a pencil line around the anchorage and writes a single word in the margin. Depth. No one argues. The room feels smaller now. The prints show a fleet that does not think in single blows. The prints show a schedule. A senior officer speaks in a low voice about distance and fuel and time. From Ulithi to Kyushu is a long reach, but the carriers will make it in a handful of days. From Ulithi to the Ryukyus is shorter still. The calendar on the wall has days crossed out in red pencil through late winter. Spring is almost here. The Fifth Fleet title has already cycled to fast carriers under a different flag officer and will cycle back again. The prints say the machine behind those title boards is what matters. If 15 carriers sleep in one lagoon, then others can be somewhere else. The staff can no longer assume gaps. They pass a sheet that shows the stern of a large carrier with a clean rectangle cut by light where the deck edge elevator sits. An Essex-class profile. Another sheet shows a shorter deck with a different proportion of island to hull. A light carrier. Counting changes again. It is not only how many decks, it is how many of each kind. The staff officer circles 2 spots and writes a small note about aircraft mixes and range bands. He does not raise his voice. He does not need to. The implication is simple. Strike composition can be tailored. Repetition can be sustained. Repair can be absorbed. One officer brings up the night attack that broke the quiet at Ulithi 2 nights after the photographs. A single aircraft over water. A violent hit on United States Ship Randolph. He stops and lets the room hold that image for a breath. Then he describes the follow-on, the repair ship sliding alongside, the crews measuring, the expected rejoining for operations in April. It is the same word from the margin made into a rhythm: depth, redundancy, return. A clerk pins the larger prints to a board and draws arcs that spread like ribs across the room. Kyushu, Okinawa, the Luzon sea lanes. The staff places small flags to show airfields that can strike outward and airfields that must be protected for the larger contest. The names of formations rise and fall in the discussion, but the prints keep dragging the talk back to the same conclusion. The United States Navy has turned an atoll into a factory that feeds carriers. The carriers rise from this factory and hit in rotation. If one is damaged, another stands ready. If one is sunk, the line does not halt. The officers feel the scale in their throats. An older captain remembers the early war months when a single enemy deck at the edge of a horizon could decide the mood of a week. He looks at the 15 counted boxes and shakes his head once. A single duel cannot settle this. The industrial answer is already afloat. He says it without heat, as if he were labeling a tool on a bench. The conclusion is not an insult and not a surrender. It is a measurement. The room reviews fuel tables for carrier groups and the range rings for heavy bombers and the timing of picket lines. Someone draws a thin pencil mark from Ulithi to a point northeast of Formosa and writes a date beside it. March 14th. The carriers can leave the lagoon then and be on station off Kyushu by March 18th for a sustained series of strikes. That is a forecast built from tides, bunkers and flying hours, not hope. The officers do not need to predict the exact target set to understand what the prints have given them. Readiness in bulk, motion on schedule. The last sheet goes up, the case closes. The air seems thinner, no one speaks for a long count. There are orders to draft, and there is a plan to defend an island chain that will pull every available aircraft and every trained crew into a trench of sky. There are flotillas to gather, pickets to arm, radar to align, fuel to move, and crews to brief on the kind of fight that grinds men down by calendar instead of by blow. A chair scrapes, papers stack. The senior officer sets his palm on the edge of the table as if to feel the weight of the prints through the wood. He looks at the arcs on the wall and at the tight blocks of carriers on the lagoon, and a thought moves across his face like a shadow. The sea is still the same color, the horizon is still the same line, but the contest has changed its scale. The photograph did not cause that change. It only removed the last doubt. He lifts the case, the door opens. The corridor is dim and quiet. Outside, the city breathes in the cold night air, and the faint sound of a freight train carries across the darkness. Somewhere far to the south, the lagoon lies under starlight, and the carriers ride gently at their moorings. Somewhere far to the east, crews are counting checklists and sleeping in their gear. The officers here have the count. They have the distances. They have the dates. They also have the realization. Night folds over the lagoon like a dark tarp. Ships hum. Projectors throw a white rectangle on a hangar deck, and sailors watch a comedy that smells faintly of popcorn and oil. Far out past the reef, a low engine line slides in from black water. A single shape finds the glide. A heartbeat, a bright point blooms and rides hard at a stern. The strike is sudden and exact. Fire claws up through steel. Men fall. Others run with hoses and stretchers and the hard rhythm of orders. Shock is real. Shock is local. The lagoon holds steady. Dawn brings repair. Barges, bump fenders and lines are made fast. A crane swings a patch plate. Teams chalk cut lines and measure with care. The ship breathes smoke and steam as damaged spaces are sealed and power comes back in stages. Across the anchorage, flight decks already turn. Tow tractors move. Ordnance crews roll bombs that thud when they meet wood. The long line of the fleet ignores the wound because the line exists to absorb wounds. It is not bravado. At mid-morning, a coded board goes up on a flagship. Departure in 3 days. A signalman repeats it with flags that flash in hard sunlight. Tugs lean into hulls, and the first carriers move out to the channel where the water deepens to a blue that looks almost black. Oilers wait beyond the reef line with hoses coiled like sleeping snakes. Destroyers shift to screen positions with neat little wakes like chalk marks on a slate. The atoll behind them looks small now. The ocean ahead looks like a factory floor with no walls. South of Tokyo, the weather reports stack up in neat strips of paper. Fronts march across maps. The staff draws bars for wind over Kyushu and arrows for sea state on the Philippine Sea. The dates line up. March 14th for sortie, March 18th for first strikes. The numbers are drawn from tide tables and fuel tables and pilot hours logged since the marshals. The machine that ties those numbers together talks in simple verbs: load, launch, recover, refuel, repeat. On the ready rooms, the chalkboards tick with air group data. Fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, night fighters that will trap after dusk on a dark deck whose crew moves by feel. Pilots sit on benches and watch the board, while a senior aviator walks a fingertip down a map and explains the run and the altitudes and the way the return legs will bend if wind shifts. He does not raise his voice. He does not sell glory. He sells a plan that treats each sortie like one gear tooth in a rack that must mesh with 1,000 others. Out at sea, the first replenishment cycle begins. Oilers ease alongside with booms out. Black hoses thicken and lift and swing across water that winks with tiny whitecaps. Fuel rushes. Ammunition ships come up next with pallet stacks that smell of wood and cordite. The deck crews move in a choreographed tangle that looks random until you see the lanes and the signals and the line of men passing 5-inch shells, hand to hand with a patience that feels like the definition of strength. When it is done, the ships tilt a little easier and the wakes lengthen. The carriers push on at a pace that would break a destroyer held at flank for too long. In Tokyo, the prints have become enlarged plates under overhead lamps. An officer traces rectangles with a ruler again and again as if the shape might change. The realization sits heavy. 15 carriers at one lagoon means that the enemy can concentrate and then disperse with confidence. A single success will not create pause. The defense of the Ryukyus must be built for a storm that does not blow itself out. The word that returns in every sentence is the same word that came out of the margin: depth. On the ocean, the task force breathes. The title boards on flagships will change again in coming weeks. 3rd Fleet, 5th Fleet. The sea does not care which card is slid into which brass slot. What matters is the rhythm under the names. Dawn launch, midday recovery, dusk strike, night cycle for the one deck that has the lights out for the mission that must finish in darkness. The sound of the catapults is a hammer you can feel in your ribs, even from the island. The smell of hot hydraulic fluid mixes with salt and spilled fuel. The bow lifts and falls and lifts again. A pilot from a fighter squadron sits with his back against a bulkhead and reads the order of the day. He runs a thumb down the column that lists tanker, rendezvous and wind over deck and combat air patrol slots over the formation. The list is long and calm. He closes his eyes and sees the photograph he had been shown during the brief. The lagoon, with the decks in rows like streets. It looked peaceful. It was not. It was a machine at rest. As dusk draws down, the carriers turn into wind, and the first night fighters launch. The deck looks like a black river broken by wands and tiny beads of light masked by gloves and bodies. The aircraft leap forward and vanish into the dark. The sea ahead is empty to the eye. The crews act as if it is crowded with schedules. The feeling you get watching them is not hurry, but inevitability. The line is moving, and it is very hard to stop a line once it is moving. On Kyushu, a farmer stands at the edge of a field and looks up at a sky that seems ordinary. A thin overcast glows where the sun sinks. He hears nothing yet. The island breathes. In a few days, the air will fill with the sound of engines and the echo of flak and the whistles of falling pieces that do not care where they land. He does not know the dates. He knows the season. The season has changed. The officers at sea and the officers ashore are separated by water and belief. One side has a picture of 15 carriers at anchor and a calendar that tells them when to move. The other side has a picture of home ground and a faith that a single sharp strike can break a rhythm. Both sides will learn what a rhythm can endure. Both sides will measure themselves by what remains after the first week. Night deepens. The wakes glow faintly. The fleet breathes in steady beats. The bows rise and fall, and the dark is full of small, precise motions that point the same way. The lagoon is behind them. The photograph rides in a drawer that locks with a small click. The next proof will not be on paper. It will be written in the sky. Dawn on the 18th day of March breaks pale and cold over an empty line of sea. The carriers turn into wind and the decks come alive. Engines cough and settle. Wings fold out with a last clack. Chocks lift. The 1st Division goes down the deck and steps into the air with a smooth lift that never gets old. Then another. Then another. The rhythm is the point. Far ahead, the southern shores of Kyushu climb out of haze in slow detail. Fields, villages, a thin grid of roads. Airfields sit on the flat ground like cards laid face up. Kanoya, Kushira, Miyazaki, Oita. The first strikes come in low and hard and peel across runways in lines that look like handwriting. Bombs walk down concrete. Fuel bursts in black flowers and runs. Dispersal revetments take hits that throw earth and corrugated tin. Pilots call plain words and numbers and turn for the sea. The 2nd Division arrives before the smoke thins. Scramble sirens at coastal bases bring engines to life. Fighters claw for height through their own dust. A few make the merge and fire into tight knots of Avengers and Hellcats and Helldivers as the American formations wheel and hold to timing like a metronome. The smoke thickens. The runways buckle. The targets change from aircraft to repair shops to fuel to parked trucks to anything that might help an airfield breathe after noon. Another wave comes in. Another wave goes out. The coast lies under a slow-moving ceiling of intent. At midday, the carriers recover with decks blackened by rubber and dotted with men who move like clock hands. Hooks catch, tires screech. Pilots climb down and drink water and stare for a moment at nothing. Crew chiefs lean in and talk to machines as if to mules. The catwalks smell of hot metal and salt. Then the afternoon launches begin. The ships turn again, and the bow lifts, and the first aircraft goes, and the next, and the next. The numbers on the morning board are being turned into cuts on maps inland. The 19th day of March opens with a different aim. The strikes slide deeper toward the inland sea, where heavy hulls sit under the protection of docks and shore guns. Kure and Kobe hold shapes that have haunted briefings since the first months of the war. The pilots keep to their altitudes and their times, and work through flak that looks almost solid when the bursts align. Smoke stacks and cranes and the backs of dry docks loom out of haze in great right angles that swallow aircraft and return them shaken. Bombs fall. Some miss. Some do not. A ship takes a hard hit and lists then rights itself on the slow spring of water. Another smokes from the bow and crawls for shelter. The inland geography folds the sound back on itself so that every explosion seems to echo. South, and a little off the coast, a carrier in the formation turns at recovery speed when a single enemy aircraft drops out of a ragged cloud stack and dives with a clean, terrible line. 2 bombs fall fast and true. Both hit. One punches through and explodes deep. The deck is suddenly a furnace, and the island vanishes in a sheet of flame. Men crawl, men drag others. Some fall still, hoses writhe, foam hisses. Magazines are flooded by hand as the ship fights to remain a ship and not a pyre. The formation holds its shape while escorts weave a tight guard and a screen of destroyers throws up a wall of fire that seems to bend the sky. Through afternoon and into evening, the damaged carrier lives by inches. Tugs ease close and back away when fresh bursts erupt from hidden corners. Damage control teams move with the steadiness of old farmers putting out a barn fire one bale at a time. Fires shrink. The list eases, and then returns, and then eases again. The ship is not pretty now. She is black and red and grey and wet and alive. She will not launch aircraft today. She will not launch tomorrow. She is still here. Elsewhere in the formation, another carrier takes a hit that rips a hole where the deck meets the island. She staggers and then steadies and keeps flying. A third catches a night attacker that slams down out of darkness with no warning except the sudden change in the air. The blow cuts lights and shakes nerves, but the crews set their jaws and the work continues. The line closes ranks and the schedule flexes and closes. The plan is not elegant, it is persistent. On Kyushu, the airfields that can still breathe try to launch. Pilots climb into machines that smell of fuel and damp canvas and old hope. Some make it to altitude. Many do not. The flak maps in American ready rooms gain pencil crosses where guns are heavier than expected and lines through places that now only need to be watched. The tempo thuds on. Fighters sweep. Bombers hammer workshops and yards and ships that thought the inland sea would be a moat. It is not a moat. It is a catalogue. In Tokyo, the enlarged plates sit on easels beside fresh reconnaissance summaries. Staff officers do not need to be told what the cycle will look like once the fleet moves to support landings at Okinawa. They can see it in the news reached by phone and in the times between reports. Launch at dawn. Strike the airfields. Strip the reaction. Reach for the inland targets. Recover. Refuel. Rearm. Repeat. The word from the margin has grown into a fact that fills rooms. Depth. The carriers are not jewels. They are tools from a bin used in series. In the evening, a pilot on a light carrier walks to the edge of the deck and looks down at the ocean moving under the bow. He thinks of the photograph taken over the lagoon and of the neat rows that looked like peace. He knows now what the picture really showed. It showed a fleet built to take hurt and keep its place in line. It showed a way of war that turns shock into schedule. He does not find comfort in the thought. He finds direction. Night comes in heavy. The formation turns in measured degrees for the run-out. The wakes glow faint and then vanish. Radios speak softly. Below decks, men sleep where they can find a place that does not rattle. Above, on a dark island ladder, a young signalman leans on a rail and watches the horizon as if it might speak back. The sky answers with a cold wind, the ships answer with motion. The work resumes at first light. Morning breaks hard and clean on the 20th day of March. The wind stiffens and the sea lifts in long, even swells. The formation holds its lines as if set with a chalk snap. Crews move with a practiced quiet that looks like calm and is not calm at all. Launch cycles resume. Recovery cycles resume. The movement feels like a loom, each pass laying another thread across Kyushu and the inland sea until the pattern shows through smoke and dust. On the decks, the deck-edge cranes swing and the ordnance dollies clatter. A young plane captain taps a wheel chock with his boot and looks down at his hands as if they belong to someone else. He breathes and looks up at the airplane and speaks to it in a voice too low to hear. The pilot arrives, and they speak only a few words. The aircraft rolls forward, and the tail lifts, and the sea falls away. The catwalk crew watches until the speck becomes a line, and then nothing. Inland crews who have slept in their gear stumble into daylight that tastes of ash. Fuel is scarce. Spare parts are scarce. The men are not scarce, but many are too young or too tired to climb into a cockpit and find the edge of the fight. The field officers walk the revetments and count airworthy machines, and out of habit they add a few to the tally that are not really ready. Hope does that to men who have learned arithmetic from shortage. The siren calls anyway. Engines catch. A few climb. Most remain as shapes under netting that fools no one. The weather turns in mid-afternoon. Low cloud comes on in sheets. The sea darkens. The carriers still turn into wind, and the cycles do not stop, they only lean. Pilots return with stories of flak that felt like a floor, and of glimpses of heavy hulls that looked chained to their berths by steel as thick as a man. One pilot says he saw a ship move under him, as if trying to hide inside the harbour itself. He draws a rough outline with a pencil and shades the bows. The intelligence officer nods once and pins the page beside the map with a single tack. A destroyer rides close to the damaged carrier and trades lines in a sawtooth sea. Messages pass hand to hand and then hearts to mouth as a stretcher sways over a wedge of dark water and lands with a softness that feels like a prayer answered. A chaplain stands in a quiet corner with his hands behind his back and says nothing because nothing he can say will help men who only need more hose pressure and more time. Minutes pass like stones rolled uphill. The list eases by a fraction and then holds. By late day, the strikes turn again to airfields because the cycle that protects ships begins at runways. Craters widen. Repair crews fall back and begin again, and fall back again. A row of drums goes up in a curtain of black smoke that shifts and lifts and collapses like a living thing. In the confusion, a pair of fighters from opposite sides cross at a height barely above the treetops, and neither fires because each is too busy not hitting the ground. They vanish into separate valleys, and the moment leaves no trace except two hearts beating too fast. Night comes early with the weather. The formation tightens until a man could believe the ships share a single breath. Radio circuits speak in clipped phrases. The radar scopes paint thin threads that thicken and then fade. The night fighters trap one by one on decks that shine in slits and beads and vanish to black between landings. The crews on the bow wipe rain from their faces and taste salt and oil and something like battery acid when the wind shifts. They keep working because the line demands it. The line gives purpose back in return. In Tokyo, a briefing runs late under lights that hum. The enlarged photographs of Ulithi stand on one side of the room like witnesses. Reports from Kyushu stack up on the other side like a jury. The discussion moves in circles that shrink toward the same center. The enemy can strike in series and in depth. The enemy can repair in place and at sea. The enemy can return on schedule, even after loss. A staff colonel draws 3 rectangles on a sheet of paper and writes a date beneath each. He taps the paper with the back of a fingernail and says nothing more. No one asks him to explain. At sea, the task force alters course by a few degrees for the next day's approach. The sea eases and then lifts again. The damaged carrier settles into the protection of two cruisers that pace her like patient cattle dogs. The rest of the line looks forward. Pilots in ready rooms rub their eyes and read the new boards. Fuel calculations shift by small amounts that feel large when a man thinks about a deck in rain at the end of a long leg. The navigator draws a pencil line on a chart and checks it against the wind, and then draws it again a hair to the south. On the 21st day of March, the weather clears just enough for work. The strikes go in with a steadiness that feels heavier than the violent days, because persistence wears more than shock. The crews find new targets, not because there is novelty, but because there is always one more junction, one more storage shed, one more line of trucks, one more corner of a yard where men have tried to hide a thing that must not be found. The flak still rises. A few fighters still make the merge. Losses mount in ticks and notches, not in crashes of cymbals. The day closes with a sky the colour of lead and a sea the colour of slate. The damaged carrier keeps living. The wounded move by stages, from stretcher to bunk, to a wardroom pressed into service as a quiet place. The living write names with a pencil on a mess bench, and fold the page and put it in a pocket, because there will be a letter later, and letters have to begin with a name and a date. A boatswain's mate walks the starboard side and checks a line with a hand that knows rope by feel. He does not look at the stain on the deck, he looks at the splice and at the sea. News moves with gaps and lags to the men at Ulithi, who watch a patched ship shift from her berth to a repair ship and back again. They share rumours and pass a single photograph around a small circle and argue in low voices about whether the angle shows a plate already welded or a plate only tacked in place. The argument matters to them because repair is a promise disguised as metal. The men live on promises they can touch. By the time the formation turns back toward the south to breathe and reset, the arithmetic has been hammered into more than one set of minds. Strike in series, repair in parallel, sustain by schedule. The meaning of 15 carriers in a lagoon has become the feeling of many decks at sea that do not blink when one is hit. The realization that began in a camera window has ripened into an acceptance that the contest is no longer about a duel of ships, but about the endurance of a system. The sea opens to the south as the formation bends away from Kyushu to take breath. Oilers rise on the horizon like low hills, and the long hoses swing out again. Fuel moves. Ammunition comes up from holds that smell of cordite and damp wood. Men who have not slept in 2 days steal 20 minutes on a coil of line and wake with the shape of a deck still moving under them. The damaged carrier keeps station inside a ring of escorts whose wakes look like stitched seams. She lists less now. She breathes. Far behind, Ulithi returns to its quiet thunder. Barges nose through green water between repair ships and hulks with scaffolds like iron forests. A patch plate glows dull red under a canvas windbreak. A welder lifts his mask and wipes his face with the back of a glove and goes back to the seam. On a beach, a chaplain reads a short list, while the wind takes the last word and lays it down flat. The lagoon does not change its colour. It reflects what is placed upon it. In Tokyo, a late meeting runs long. The enlarged plates from the 9th day of March still stand at the edge of the room. Fresh reports from Kyushu rest in stacks that tilt under their own weight. A senior officer who has argued for a decisive blow studies the columns for a long time. He tries to imagine a plan that can bite deeply enough to slow a system that seems to grow a new limb every time an old one is cut. He cannot find the cut that will hold. He looks up, and his eyes are tired. The truth he had been pushing away for months now sits beside him like an old acquaintance. It does not raise its voice. It does not gloat. It simply remains. At sea, the title boards will change again soon, as the fleets shift names and keep the same pulse. The next arc leads toward Okinawa, where an island the size of a small prefecture will demand every craft and every man who can lift a rope or a rifle. The carriers will stand offshore and trade days and nights in measured turns, covering landings, suppressing airfields, striking at ships and depots that hide up narrow coves. The damaged carrier that lived by inches will limp away toward a rear area or will return to line after a miracle of work. Either way, the line will not leave a gap. Another deck waits. A pilot watches the wake curve away from the bow and thinks of the count that began all of this. 15. He did not see the lagoon himself, but he has seen its effect. He has flown into skies already, softened by earlier strikes, and he is trapped on decks held steady by men who never see the target. He understands that he is not the point. The point is that he is one piece in a wooden and steel argument that does not stop when one piece breaks. The thought is humbling. The thought is also freeing. He does his work and hands it back to the machine. In a small office away from the map room, a Japanese clerk enters dates and brief summaries into a ledger with ruled columns. His handwriting is neat and careful. He writes the words Ulithi and Kyushu and Inland Sea, and he writes the word carriers more times than feels reasonable. He closes the book and places it on a shelf beside others just like it. He sits for a moment with his hands folded and thinks of the water east of the city. He thinks of a fleet that does not hurry because it does not need to. The wind freshens. The sea darkens and shines. The ships lean into it and move on. Somewhere ahead waits another morning when decks will turn, and men will climb, and engines will lift, and the work will begin again. Somewhere behind, on a wall that smells of paper and dust, the contact prints from a single flight still hold their quiet. A pilot counted decks over a blue lagoon, and an empire measured the distance between belief and fact. The count did not end anything in that moment. It simply showed what had already ended. The fleet bends east to reset, and the sea erases the wake as if nothing had passed. Night brings a hard sky with few stars, and a wind that speaks in a single voice along the catwalks. Men sleep in short pieces, and wake with the shape of the work already in their hands. The damaged carrier rides with her escorts like a hunted animal inside a ring of shepherds. She is alive. She will steam. On the repair ship at Ulithi, a foreman points with a chalk nub at the last seam to close on a patch plate that sits hot and proud over shattered framing. Sparks fall. Hammers answer. A petty officer counts the last bolts in a low voice for no one but himself. The number is wrong and then right, and he smiles without humour and writes the figure again. Nearby, a line of stretchers passes to a boat with a small engine that gurgles and surges. The lagoon accepts each small motion and smooths it as if time were a liquid with weight. At sea, the operations board turns to a new day, and the same verbs. The formation will cross back into the violence soon. Okinawa waits like a black stone at the centre of a mill. Artillery dug hillsides, caves, weather, mud mines, men. The carriers will stand off and hold to the rhythm that the photograph had hinted at without saying. Decks will spit fighters into grey air at dawn and pull them back in streams of noise and rubber smoke. Bombers will nose inland and lift again, leaving straight trails of dust and fire. A system will lean forward until it finds a pace it can hold. In Tokyo, a small group gathers in a room with the curtains drawn against a morning the colour of old paper. The enlarged plates from Ulithi sit on stands along one wall. New reports lie on the table in neat stacks held with string. A captain outlines the latest strikes with a pencil point on a chart that shows Kyushu and the Inland Sea with distances marked in careful arcs. He speaks as if reading out water levels in a lock. The carriers left Ulithi on the 14th day. They struck on the 18th day. They returned on the 19th day. They will shift south and support landings at the end of the month. His tone is flat because there is no drama in arithmetic. Silence gathers after he stops. An older commander sits a little apart with his hat in his lap and his eyes on the floor. He has argued for years that the war at sea would turn on a single, decisive action that could break the enemy will. He has believed that a sharp blow delivered at a seam could burst the whole fabric. He still believes that war is made of courage and surprise, and he is not wrong. He is simply outnumbered by a different kind of truth. The photograph shows tools laid out on a bench. The last weeks show hands that know how to use them in sequence. He lifts his head. He nods once. The nod is small and final. A clerk records the meeting in a ledger with straight lines. He writes the names of places and the dates and the brief notes that make sense to men who already know the shape of events. He adds a single sentence in a narrow hand that no one will read aloud. The enemy maintains operations with depth. He blots the ink and closes the book and places it beside the earlier volumes that marched there since the first months of the war. He thinks of the blue water east of the city and of the long chain of islands that leads down to the south. He thinks of the carriers riding at anchor like patient horses and then moving off with the same patience. He understands that patience can be a weapon when it is multiplied by factories. The fleet turns north again. Signals crackle and resolve. The bows rise and fall through velvet swells. A chaplain stands out of the wind and reads a page that lists names and ranks and ages. A boatswain salutes, and the paper slides away on the air and touches the sea and vanishes. On a light carrier, a pilot tightens his harness and stares at the heel of the man in front of him and waits for the flap of a hand that will mean go. He tries not to think about the way the dark deck narrows to a knife at the bow. He hears the engine note climb. He hears his own breath. The first launches begin again. The formation spreads and tightens and spreads in a slow breathing that no longer needs commands. The ships have learned the rhythm the way men learn to walk. Off the port, bow smoke rises from a destroyer that fires at a pale smudge of an aircraft that slants down and dissolves in spray. The crew cheers once and then goes back to work. A messenger runs between islands with a folded paper that reads like the day before. Wind overdeck. Tanker rendezvous. Combat air patrol stations. Recovery windows. The words are plain and heavy. In the afternoon, a signal lamp flashes a sentence from the flagship that does not carry drama and feels like inevitability. Maintain schedule. The words travel along the line and settle. No one smiles. No one groans. Men check knots and latches and pressures and belts and bearings. The machine continues because continuation is what it was built for. In the city, a window opens on a street where bicycles move in thin lines, and women carry baskets, and a child looks up at a thin cloud that wears the shape of a wing for a heartbeat and then folds into the larger sky. Far away, a lagoon shines. Far away, a carrier with new scars turns into wind. The distance between them is measured in days and in will. The measure is nearly complete. The last light goes, and the ocean takes the color of iron. The fleet holds its formation by habit and by faith in the marks chalked on boards below decks. A signalman breathes on his hands and looks along the line and counts the shapes as if counting could keep them safe. He comes to 15 and stops and begins again out of superstition and out of memory. The count that began over a blue atoll has followed them into this night. It is still there. It will not change.